According to Kierkegaard, almost all modern stories are about anxiety, about a certain kind of anxiety that has so penetrated our culture that all stories in some way or another revolve around it. In short, these stories cause anxiety because they're so fixated on the individual and his quest to organize meaning. And you probably don't even realize that there are other ways to approach storytelling, because this style of narrative is very much the water that we swim in. But this wasn't always the case. And if we were to look back at the ancient world, to the works of the Greeks and Romans, what we'll find is an entirely different way of relating to the world and of relating to the ideas of tragedy and catharsis and how these impacted people's lives. Engaging with this is valuable because the ancients baked in certain lessons into their tragedies that we can learn from today, many of which I feel have been lost with this modern style of storytelling. And at the very least, Kierkegaard's analysis will invite a whole host of nuance into your way of viewing stories, and probably provide you with a very different perspective on how one can view the tragic genre. To me as well, Kierkegaard's analysis presents rivers of inquiry, where we might be able to look at ways of viewing ourselves as an actor within the world that are incredibly distinct from what's commonly taught. We're going to begin by looking at the essential difference between ancient tragedies and modern tragedies, and then we are going to talk about the topic of guilt. Then we'll talk about how guilt transformed from being something chiefly concerned with aesthetics and reconciliation to being much more driven by morality and anxiety. Finally, we'll conclude with an awareness of how these differences might be able to teach us some lessons about how we relate to existential anxiety and how we relate to our own place in the world, and how this might connect to ideas around surrender, nobility, and freedom. The first great popular works of drama are what we're referring to as ancient. So this is mostly going to be works by the ancient Greeks and some of the adaptations by the Romans. Modern tragedy is essentially everything that came after that, especially with Shakespeare and the explosion of the genre following his innovations. The heart of the difference is this. In ancient tragedies, the heroes are felled by fate. It is nature or the gods themselves that thwart him, and the hero's suffering is framed as a part of a wider cosmic order. In this way, the tragedy has purpose and direction. His pain is a part of a world that makes sense. Whereas moderns are ruined by their own actions. The modern hero stands and falls entirely by his own hand. In this way, he has no epic foreground, no epic heritage. Because of this modern style, the protagonists are anxious in the sense that they are concerned with the question of what to do and how to live. The answer is indeterminate, and this is torturous. Because of this, the modern hero experiences the anxiety of freedom, of the freedom to do whatever you please in a world with no divinely set structures. And because of this, the kind of pity that we show modern heroes is different from the kind that we show ancients. We cannot pity them with the same depth that we show to the ancients, because whatever sympathy we have for them is mixed with some kind of moral judgment. Ultimately, it was the hero who brought this pain upon themselves in modern tragedy. Ancients, on the other hand, preserve a certain infallibility of the soul. They were more witnesses to their own destruction, rather than architects of it. You might notice that much of ancient tragedy revolves around a cosmic order, around external structures and a world with certain rules, the violation of which will cause certain suffering. We can say that ancient tragedy is concerned with lessons about the world, whereas modern tragedy is concerned with lessons about the self. Consider the story of Oedipus. So Oedipus begins with the city of Thebes being afflicted by a plague. And Oedipus, who is the king, wants to find out what's going wrong and fix it. He sends his brother to go speak to an oracle, and the oracle says that only once the murderer of the former king of Thebes, who was a man named Laius was the king, once that murderer is found, well then the city can be relinquished from this plague. Determined, Oedipus sets off to find out who the killer was. As the story unfolds, Oedipus digs in, trying to discover more things about it, and eventually he ends up speaking to a blind prophet. And the blind prophet says to Oedipus that it is you who are the murderer. Oedipus gets all confused and begins mocking this prophet, and the prophet adds even more to their prophecy. They say, Oedipus, you shall leave the city of Thebes in rags, blind as an exile. The prophet then adds one final thing. They say that the murderer of Laius will have been Laius's own son, and that this son will end up marrying his own mother. Irate, Oedipus storms off. The plot progresses, and as more things unfold, more things seem to fall into place of this prophecy. Oedipus recalls an incident when he was on his way to the city of Thebes, and he has an encounter with a man and some of his attendants at the crossroads. There was a disagreement, and Oedipus ends up killing this man and his attendants. Unbeknownst to him, that man was Laius, who was the king. More parts of the story unfold. It's revealed that Laius adopted Oedipus when he was a child, and thus Oedipus was the killer of his own father. And Oedipus ended up marrying his own mother by another set of circumstances. And once it is revealed, Oedipus's wife and mother is so horrified by this truth that she hangs herself. And Oedipus, devastated by all of this, blinds himself and leaves Thebes as an exile. This story exemplifies the difference between an ancient tragedy and a modern one. There was no way for Oedipus to know that he was fulfilling that prophecy. It's no exaggeration to say that he was innocent. When Oedipus came to marry his mother, for example, he had no idea that she was his mother, and they ended up meeting after Oedipus saved the city of Thebes, which was being tortured by a sphinx. And when Oedipus killed Laius, who was his father, and again he had no idea, what had happened was there was this disagreement, and the stranger struck Oedipus on the head with his staff, which then led to the stranger's death. Nonetheless, Oedipus's actions lead to his ruin. He is innocent, and yet he suffers. It is tragic. Oedipus is essentially a subject of the world, and yet he still faced this fate in spite of his innocence. I think the inevitability of suffering, even if one is noble in heart, is something which I think is missing in a lot of our modern art. As an audience, when we engage with this story, we connect with a deeply human trait. That is how the consequences of things far beyond our control can sometimes afflict us terribly, and how, in spite of this, we must bear the burdens that come to us. Many plays from this period feature this set of ideas, like the Bacchae or Antigone. The defining traits of ancient tragedy are that the hero must contend with a world that is moving against them. And not only this, the fact that the world is moving against them is used to teach that there is some flaw in the way the hero is conducting themselves which is causing their fate, unbeknownst to the hero's own intention. And so the hero's actions are flawed, but not flawed by intention, rather they are flawed because they're going against natural law. In this way, ancient tragedies were more communal and less individualistic. It was not really about the subjective experience of this individual. It was much more about what we can learn about the world through the vehicle of this individual's suffering. All the pain they went through was a way to teach a fundamental lesson about the universe. It isn't about somebody trying to find their place in the world. It's more so the world molding a person into place. That's why the introspection of these ancient heroes is so simple. They come to understand their troubles as a part of a grander cosmic order. Now, let's contrast this with the most famous modern tragedy of all time, Hamlet. Compared to the ancient heroes, Hamlet is laden with internal complexity. Much of the focus is on Hamlet himself, on his own inward doubts and fears, and his struggles to make decisions in a world with no clear right or wrong. We, as the audience, are drawn into the subjective world of a man contending in a place with complex ethical challenges. There is also within Hamlet a fascination with the individual subjectivity. Many of the questions of the play revolve around Hamlet himself. Is he feigning madness? Is he actually mad? Many of the soliloquies focus on the internal dialogue of Hamlet. There's a fascination with the interiority of this person, with his inward world. What's he thinking? A fascination with psychology. Additionally, Hamlet is agentic. He is the one driving the plot forward, making his own fate. This is symbolically put forward very powerfully when he stages a play within the play to determine who his father's killer is. I won't do a full analysis of Hamlet, in part because the characteristics of this tragic hero carry through to most all tragic heroes that we see nowadays. The important parts to understand are that, firstly, modern tragedies are focused more on the individual experience in one's inward subjectivity of the struggle of a person to make sense of a world guided by self-set moral values, whereas ancients are more focused on the external world and on understanding how their interaction with the world around them shapes their suffering because they might come to violate some kind of principle, godly decree, or natural law. Secondly, moderns are agentic, they control themselves and the world around them more, whereas ancients are much more passive in this sense. They are fundamentally subject to fates or the whims of gods or broader social structures. Finally, moderns tend to exist in a world that de-emphasizes cosmic order, a world defined by the freedom for people to determine what they themselves think is right or wrong. There are no divine structures or no much broader things to determine what is clear, unlike in ancient tragedies, where these things feature and often actually drive the entirety of the plot forward. These differences lead to a radically altered experience of guilt. For the ancients, the guilt of the hero has an aesthetic and beautiful quality to it. I once heard it said that art is when every element is in its perfect place, and in ancient tragedy, the suffering of the hero is in its perfect place. The suffering of the hero in ancient tragedy occurs because it had to, because they went against God's whims or against some law of the social structure. They had to suffer. It was simply necessity. This is why Aristotle said that tragedies cause catharsis, because as an audience, when we engage with this particular kind of suffering that the ancient hero was going through, we experience a catharsis which is like a moral cleansing. It's a cleansing in the sense that there's a purification. At the end of it all, the waters run clear, as ultimately the orderliness of the world is affirmed, even if it came at the expense of the pain of this person. In modern stories, however, the guilt is entirely different. The guilt of the hero is his to bear. There is no wider web of gods or laws to explain his pain. And unlike the ancients, his suffering may have been completely arbitrary. If you ask, why did any of this have to happen, you'll hear silence. There is no chorus or voices from on high to state the reason. Here I think of the ending of Bojack Horseman, when Bojack and Diane are sitting on the roof, aware that this is the last time these two people are ever going to speak to each other. And on this occasion, Bojack shares a story. He says that one of his prison inmates is tyrannically dominating movie night, and this tyrant adores this one film. So Bojack decides to play a trick, and he makes this film disappear. At the next movie night, this inmate is furious, he's raging, and Bojack comes in and calms him down and says, hey, just this once, why don't we watch this other movie, this new movie? And then the inmate agrees and falls in love with the new movie. And so now Bojack has to watch the new movie every movie night instead. Diane chuckles and says, oh, you kind of made your own bed with that one, huh? And Bojack replies, that's the story of my life. And then they stare silently into the long and endless night. The poignancy of the ending of Bojack points to how tragedy has evolved. Bojack's suffering is his to bear. He caused it. He is not innocent. The catharsis that we get from it is not from moral cleansing. The orderliness of the world is not affirmed. Rather, whatever catharsis we take from it comes from the deep understanding of this individual's suffering specifically. Again, the modern story draws us so much towards interiority, towards the internal world of this character, and a fascination with how he determined his own fate. And this is distinctly different from ancient works, where whatever the inward world of the narrator was is less the focus. It's much more focused on these external structures, on the world around them, and how the interactions with it will shape fate ultimately. Now, the modern ancient world are different, and the evolution of tragedy mirrors the evolution in the world as a whole. From around the 16th century with the Age of Enlightenment, we've drifted away from viewing the world as something ordained by divine law and rules and all this, towards something that's much more focused on individuals, one where many of the dominant beliefs are that moral law is subjective and every individual has the freedom to make his own meaning within it. These insights from Kierkegaard can point us towards some fascinating questions, which to me gesture towards embracing some of the fateful elements of life more, and perhaps considering some of the aesthetic virtues of subjecting yourself to structures that are beyond the self, to structures which have obligations, rules, and laws. When we think of ourselves as so in control of our own fate, I think it can be easy to lose sight of something which is simply true, which is just how much of the world we have no jurisdiction over. This isn't at all to suggest that we should go back to believing that we are non-agentic and have no self-determination at all. Rather, it's simply to invite a more nuanced perspective, as even character traits that people take a lot of pride in might be predominantly fateful. How much of your own intelligence was a product of your cultivation versus how much of it was due to consequence of birthplace and the resources that you had. How many of your social and moral values are things that you decided on, and how many of them are simply the consequences of the roots from which you've grown. This is not an either or, it's not a black and white picture, but I think that the nuance is useful, and that perhaps the line between choice and choicelessness is not quite where most of us have drawn it. Additionally, I think there's something beautiful about the fatalism of ancient tragedy, about the notion of coming to accept and surrender to the sometimes inevitability of suffering, in spite of whatever intentions or innocence we may have. Engaging with the world in this way, perhaps viewing ourselves as slightly tragic, a bit more bound by things that we wish we weren't bound to, I think that we open the doors towards reconciliation, and the middle way between these views, between agency and non-agency, is a vibrant field. Finally, I do think there's something worth contemplating in his analysis of this aesthetic guilt. There is something to being more fatefully driven in the world. There are modes of being in the world wherein free will can seem to dissipate, subjected to what is simply understood to be necessary. For Simone Weil, the cultivation of attention and the merging of one's gaze with God can take one to a place where one loses their individuality and becomes more like an avatar of Christ. In Buddhism, it is said that as one walks the path and sees how more and more things are determined by dependent origination, that they can see how much of the world is simply unfolding by itself, how much of it is a process of natural law. And to me, Kierkegaard's analysis of ancient tragedy can provide an aesthetic heart to these ways of being in the world, a beautiful bloodbeat, a through line, a sensibility, and a way of engaging with drama and stories that is wholly new and inspiring in a way which is, I think, quite hard to explain in our modern world. Anyway, thank you for watching.